Welcome to our second video in the series Conflict Within the Colonies. Today we will be looking at Metacom's War. As a textbook recap of Metacom's War, so again, you will have read about this. I want to briefly cover the key points before moving forward in some of our skills work. So, to begin with, Native American relations were extremely complex within the colonies. Prior to this, we've been looking at specifically the Spanish colonization within the Caribbean, but now we're moving into North America, where we'll continue to look at the complex relationships between English settlers, French settlers, Dutch settlers, and the Native Americans within those regions. Now, because of this, the tensions on competition between the nations already existed without European involvement. So, what I mean by that is Native American nations already had their own interpersonal conflicts as well as regional conflicts. Not only do you have that, but now you're adding in the layer of European involvement. And so at this point in time, we see a heightened moment of alliances that are developing between Native American groups and European settlers. Specifically, in this instance, we see the alliance develop between the Wampanoag and Plymouth colony. So, Wampanoag leader Metacom, or otherwise known by the English as King Philip, he sought to copy English ways in order to coexist with the growing colony within Massachusetts and nearby Rhode Island. In order to do this, they engaged in selling crops and maintaining land, but this ultimately led to an increased tension between Native Americans and the English settlers. For example, when Native Americans sold things such as pork, the English accused them of undercutting prices. And when they as in Native Americans killed invasive hogs, they were convicted for defying English property rights. Because of this, Metacom felt that there wasn't a possibility to coexist with the growing English settlements nearby. And so instead, he devises a plan to expel the English colonists from that region. And what he ends up doing is he allies himself with neighboring native nations in order to create a forceful military attack on growing English settlements. Now, what comes of this is what's known in history as Metacom's War. It lasts from 1675 to 1676, and it targets men, women, children by burning their homes, taking their resources, killing, and taking others as captives. This is only going to come to a close with a few effects, okay? So, to cover those effects, first, conflict only ended when Native Americans ran out of gunpowder and other necessary tools. In addition to that, Metacom was killed, and it led to the falling apart of the war effort itself. As a result, of this war, natives killed a fifth of English towns within Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and nearly 1,000 settlers were killed. And at this point in time, that's about 5% of the adult population. Surviving warriors of Native American nations who had allied for Metacom's war ended up mainly leaving the area and intermarrying with Western tribes and formed alliances with the French, who had stronger relations with the Native Americans for the purpose of the fur trade. Now, the war didn't eliminate the presence of Native Americans within the region. There were definitely groups that still stayed around. They did not all immediately move west, but it also led to increased relational tensions between the two groups. So for skills, I want to take a look at an SAQ question. This is actually a question that you guys were asked on your period 1 exam. And this was a section of that SAQ that really got a lot of mixed responses and that we seem to struggle with. So we're going to break this down in the context of Metacom's War. So just to recap, the question was briefly explain one example of how Native American societies resisted change brought by contact with Europeans in the same period. A lot of you referenced the resistance for conversion for Christianity, and that's a fantastic example. To dive a little deeper into another strong example, we're going to break down Metacom's War. And so we're going to be using the acronym ace, right? Because you want to ace the SAQ. And if we're looking at the first one, so what we want to do immediately is we want to answer the question directly. So in this instance, we might say something like Native Americans resisted change by Europeans by initiating war to combat the pressures to adapt to European cultural and religious norms. For example, Metacom's war. So within this, we've immediately and directly answered the question. How are they resisting? They're resisting through action of war. Why are they doing that? Because they're fighting against cultural and religious norms. And then what's an example? Metacom's war. So now we want to cite our reason. Why are we talking about this in order to answer this question? So we might say something like, despite trying to coexist with English settlers in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and nearby Rhode Island Colony, the Wampanoag were consistently challenged with their sale of goods and their treatment of English property, such as killing hogs, which were invading their there and ruining their cornfields. Now, side note, Mrs. Shinaki definitely has a run-on sentence right there, but we get the gist, right? This is our reason. This is why they're fighting in that war. This is why they turn to war as a resistance to change. All right, finally, we want to expand on our reasoning. So we might say something like, it became clear to leader Metacom, also known to the English as King Philip, that coexistence was no longer an option. He instead allied with neighboring nations such as the Nipmucs to eradicate English settlers from the area and reestablish their claims to the land. The war lasted a year and devastated nearly 5% of the colonial population. It ultimately ended with the death of Metacom and solidified long-lasting tension between settlers and surrounding Native American nations, as well as intensified Native alliances with the French. The biggest thing on an SAQ is going to be first directly answering the question and then providing the reason why. But when you are about to start expanding on that specific factual info, that is the number one opportunity to start name dropping, okay? You want to show the reader that there is no doubt that you know exactly what you're talking about. So here we're referencing not only Metacom, but we're referencing the fact that we know he was also called King Philip. We're referencing the fact that not only are they neighboring with Native nations, but we can name an exact nation in which they're fighting with. And we can also explain long-term effects of this form of resistance, specifically the fact that 5% of the colonial population was killed and Native Americans are allying with the French, which obviously will have a greater toll as we start to look at events coming up in later periods. So this is just a quick breakdown for some SAQ practice. Thanks for watching this video for Conflict Within the Colonies, Metacom's War.